Good afternoon, everybody, again. I welcome you to one of the two parallel sessions. My name is Norbert Frey, and I'm happy to chair this session on the youth and students in 1968. Yesterday evening, in this talk with the curators of this very interesting and enlightening exhibition, we heard at some point from one of the curators as an answer to a question, yes, March 68 in Poland happened during the international or even global youth revolt, but no, there were not much links between those students in Warsaw and in other Polish university cities and the students in the West. Now today, I think, or during this session, I think we will take a closer look to this question, to this problem, whether there were links or not, in a couple of, as I can see, rather well-composed papers which might put things together if we hear them all together. The first paper is in the form of a comparison between the GDR and Poland by Burkhard Olszowski. The second paper will take an even broader look to the socialist bloc by Tom Jones. And he, as far as I understand it from the prospect, he will apply the idea of a transnational generational phenomenon on the socialist youth organizations. Dragos Petrescu takes a closer look at Romania, and Andrei Czyżewski. Yeah, it's hard for German to pronounce it. Andrei Czyżewski takes a special look, a case study on Lodz. So these are the four papers. And in doing these four papers, we might get a general view, the picture of a country and that of a Polish city. And all of this together should enable us to answer the question of how March 68 in Poland can and, in fact, should be contextualized. Now, what we don't get is the reception, or at least this is what I assume we won't get, the reception of the events in March 68 in Poland in the West during this section. And this is, for me at least, the opportunity to mention that there indeed was some sort of awareness of what was going on in Poland, even in the critical young student generation. For instance, we saw this picture in the exhibition about from Berlin, where people were standing with transparents and arguing critically against the events in Poland. And more important, probably because he always tends to talk about it, is the case of Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who in Paris made a strong point in supporting, as the more or less one of the main leaders of the Paris events, to demonstrate his solidarity with the Polish students and to especially acknowledge Modzelewski and Jacek Kuron. So, I mean, there was probably not that much of resonance in the West, but there was resonance. This is at least something I wanted to underline in the beginning. And now our first speaker will be Dr. Burkhard Olszewski. And I think I introduce all of the panelists when they are about to speak. So Dr. Olszewski is associate at the Federal German Institute of Culture and History of Germans in Eastern Europe in Oldenburg. He graduated from Humboldt University. He was for quite a while in the Warsaw office of the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity. His research interests include comparative social history, East and Central European history, politics of history, and historical memory. And he will speak about protest and disobedience of the Jews in the GDR and in Poland, comparative considerations around the year 1968. And all of our speakers, of course, will carefully observe the 20 minutes rule.
Yes. Thank you, Chairman, for the introduction. The following, I will give you some insights about the socio-political conditions in the GDR and Poland, and then I would like to focus on attitudes and behavior of young people, workers as well as students, and in Poland and GDR, and at the end I will provide some considerations about similarities, differences of both states and both groups. When we are looking then to the socially active and politically opposing people of 1968 in Poland and in GDR, there's a predominantly age cohort between the age of 20 and 30. This use is a global feature of the revolt. Age represents both a connecting element between these two countries and the bond between students and workers, expressing their discontent and partly protest in Poland and the GDR. The non-conformist workers were mostly young, usually under 30. Protest wasn't usually expressed on their workplace, though rather outside on the street. In addition to these similarities, there are recognizable differences in the willingness to protest. This was more pronounced among young GDR workers than among their Polish colleagues. Searching for the reasons for the differing readiness to protest, a cursory look to the working and living conditions of Polish and GDR workers are helpful. Poland and the GDR experienced a stormy phase of migration from the countryside to the cities in the 1950s. The Stalinist industrialization required workers, especially in heavy industry, offered educational opportunities, professional careers, but also the break from their rural traditions. In Poland, migration processes remained in the 60s. However, the motive slightly changed. In the 60s, the increasing desire for personal freedom or for welfare promoted the intra-Polish migration, as the Polish village increasingly came to define by its backwardness. Particularly, young women left their place of origin at the same time, often from Eastern Poland. In the 60s, in Poland and in the GDR can be regarded, despite considerable shortages of goods and other problems, as a period of small stabilization. Now I would like to turn then on the March events and the Polish workers. The March events in Poland in 1968 cannot be reduced to the student protest alone, although hardly any joint action of students and workers have become known. Links between them can be found on different levels. In March 68, there were solidarity actions among workers, information which the rulers at the same time suppressed about the workers' background and motives. Unfortunately, we don't know much due to the lack of numerous or significant number of witness reports from workers. However, in both countries, workers mostly did not protest in factories, as I already mentioned, but rather outside. They did not act as a working class, but rather as citoyens. In particular, there were young workers, apprentices, persons of the same age as the students. Rather small group of workers took part in the demonstration marches and painted slogans that appears on the wall, like here in Warsaw and other Polish streets. Like, for example, workers supports students. However, there were not any of these pamphlets and solidarity cases. The students and intellectuals also failed to mobilize a larger part of Polish workers. In addition to the state repression and defamation, social differences played a role. Students and workers differed in their specific aims and to their origins and their habitus. While demands were made at the university, for example, ending the censorship and granting of liberties, dissatisfied workers were usually concerned much more on higher wages, labor standards, and better food supply. There was not a common language here, and the Polish rulers were quite effectively to split a potential joint opposition along this gap. Particularly disturbing for Polish students was the fact that at least some workers actively supported the state power by participating in the suppression of a demonstration here on the university campus. And also we have, well, the cases when workers, it seems to be more old workers, took part in these state propaganda meetings in factories. The question is to what degree they deliberately go to these meetings or they were forced to go there. Now some insights about the East German workers. In the 1960s, there was a significant decline of protest behavior by East German workers. To give you just a number, in year 1960, there were still 166 strikes across the whole country, but in 1968, we just faced 15 strikes for whatever reasons. But the reasons generally were the slowly growing prosperity. Oh, no, sorry. The reasons for the decline was the slowly growing prosperity and the abolition of Saturday work in 1967 and a better regulation of company processes during the work. Also, a significant point was the stronger control of a security apparatus right now in the companies. So political and collective acts of resistance became increasingly an external phenomenon. When disputes arose with the state power, then, however, in particular, young workers were involved. know some words about the students, what I would like to distinguish both groups. The Polish sociologist Hanna Schwieder-Ziemba pointed out that students and also pupils in the 1960s generally showed a positive attitude towards values of socialism. However, they were indifferent to concrete political matters. In March '68, however, occurred a collision of two worlds, how she stated it. On the one hand was a world of apolitical youth, which was convinced that they could realize their ideas and values within the framework of the given system. On the other side was the Communist Party and the securities apparatus, which existed beyond their sphere of interest and also the sphere of most well-educated young people. The clashes of these worlds in the March demonstrations and the arrest were a shock for the Polish students, leading to a sudden politicization of them. How did it look like the situation for East German youth and students in the 1960s? With the building of the Berlin Wall in summer 1961, the so-called exit option, so emigrating to West Germany, didn't exist anymore, it was blocked. The GDR rulers tried in the years after building the wall to integrate the youth with some stimulating steps. For example, the so-called Youth Act from 1963, also promoting a more liberal cultural policy, including the new bands and musics were allowed to entertain. And they also installed a so-called youth radio, which was quite outspoken compared to the traditional radio stations in the GDR. These offers implied a mixture of one side recognition, other side some future offers, but also the feeling of giving them some power, which was particularly appealing for some students, especially if they came from homes where the parents had a burdened past, so a National Socialist past. Despite these characteristics of an integrated or a more integrated GDR youth, there are significant forms of disobedience and protest in the second half of the 1960s. These protests has much to do with the de-Stalinization, with a re-Stalinization of the GDR in the second half of the 60s, but it has also a lot to do with the Prague Spring and the reforms in Czechoslovakia and the CSSR. The sympathies of East German youth was closely connected with this Prague Spring and also with the head Alexander Dubček. It was not much a result of an ideological or a theoretical debate about that, what's happened in Czechoslovakia, but was rather a result of a new hope of positive change and a less restrictive life. In general, one can argue that the influence of the changes in Czechoslovakia was much more cultural than the direct ideological influence. Evidence of a direct imitations affects a rather rare. Nevertheless, it's obvious that some GDR students were oppressed by these protest culture, as well as from Prague, but also from the western part of Germany. And they intended to start similar actions in their own countries, at their own in universities. But finally, nothing worked really out. So there was not a final action taken, though there were many discussions which were going on. When in the early hours of August 21st in 1968, the news broadcasted that the Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia, many people in the GDR experienced a terrible blow. The moral indignation was great. There were numerous of protests, individual refusals, but also helpless gestures of resistance. Now I would like to consider some differences and similarities between both countries and both groups, so workers as well as students. First, the readiness of Polish students to protest in March 1968 was much more developed than compared to those in the GDR, which had also something to do with their socialization and the kind of de-Stalinization which happened in Poland after 1956. And also the quite liberal university education. So if you're taking a closer look to higher education, and a real Sovietization never happened in Poland, but it happened definitely in East Germany. A Polish speciality was certainly the connection between 1968 and the anti-Semitic campaign launched from above, together with corresponding rallies, in particular in factories. Although the Polish workers took part in these rallies, as I already mentioned, but they were predominantly passive. It seems to be that just a minority participated with a conviction or even acted with its own initiative. Another interesting point is, how the Poles reacted on the Prague Spring. The reforms in Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring, provoked a rather small and rather ambivalent reaction in Poland. In particular, after suppressing the student unrest in March, Polish society hardly participated in the transformation or in Czechoslovakia, besides sympathy due to the Czechs and Slovaks who dared to challenge the Soviet Union. We also faced some long-lived stereotypes towards the southern neighbor, like unreliability or the tendency to betrayal, seemingly hostility to the Poles, and interestingly, a friendliness to Germans. In the GDR, as I already mentioned, there was a quite broad sympathy for the Prague Spring, and then much bitterness about the suppression after 21st of August. Further similarities are between both groups is the demanding for justice, also a kind of future optimism, even the repression things happened, and partly also the participation of building or creating a modern country. This is, of course, something which the students showed and shared these attitudes. Another significant point, and this is much distinguishing to this, what we have seen in the West, the 68ers, there was no really networking between groups from different cities. So the protest was quite spontaneously, there was not much linkage between them, and there was actually no so-called autonomous politicization. So now the politicization came from the repression, and the students then had to react on that. In the contrary to the West, there, and probably we will speak about that later on, or my colleagues will present about that, but I would like to make a point at least. In the contrary to the West, there's not much evidence for a conflict with the parents or the so-called generation conflict. The East German societies had never reached, or at least Poland and East Germany had never reached the status of a socio-economic consolidation, typical for the West at that time. So the youth was predominantly binded with gratefulness to their parents. Much less conflicts with parents they simply had. One conflict zone was the past, but then predominantly the Stalinist past and the National Socialist past for the East Germany. Well, that would be another referat, but it was predominantly kept in oblivion and was not brought to wider discussions, or even in families, probably not. So finally, I would like to make one last point. The Polish collective experience of March 1968 was decisive in the turn of the upcoming protests movements in 1970 and 1980 with the Solidarity movement. Exactly this lesson had been learned, that students and workers cannot be separated again, and that makes the Polish case very interesting and special. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Olszewski. The next speaker is Dr. Tom Jones. He is a historian from Belgium. He earned his degree at the University in Leuven. He is a member of the Human and Social Studies Foundation in Sofia and currently a fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. He had numerous fellowships, also one in Jena, I can see here. And he is the author of Student Politics in Communist Poland, Generations of Consent and Dissent. And he has published widely on this topic. So we are hearing him now with his paper on Was 68 a Transnational Generational Phenomenon in the Socialist Bloc, from the student rebellion to the crisis in youth organizations.
Thank you. I z góry przepraszam, że nie rozmawiam po polsku dzisiaj, ale skoro zwyczajnie rozmawiam po angielsku na międzynarodowych konferencjach, to i dziś będę rozmawiał po angielsku. So thank you for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here and invited by the organizers to take part in this panel that deals mainly with the student movement aspect of 1968 and of March 1968. And as we know from this conference, March 68 in Poland has very different aspects, but as somebody who researches student movements, I tend to see that one as the most interesting and the most important to me. And as already has been pointed out in the general introduction to the panel, 1968, of course, is this iconic symbol of the global year of the student and year of student protests, very often and this not only by observers but by protagonists and historians in Poland. You would get the reaction, well, what happened in March 1968 had nothing to do with what was going on in the West. You would see usually a reaction, well, there were some links with Czechoslovakia. Even those studies that deal with Czechoslovakia usually make the comparison with the West. Now, I personally started to get interested is that why are we always looking West when it comes to the student protest in '68? And in particular, because 2 decades later, in 1989, we see students at the forefront of grassroots opposition movements in a real transnational moment in which young people are emulating each other's demands, each other's protest repertoires, even naming their independent organizations in the same way. This is only 20 years, and I started out with this question, well, can we discern certain similar elements when it comes to 1968? Because after all, there are 3 important things to take into account. First, we're dealing with a rather comparative generational experience. In all the countries of the socialist camp, barring the Soviet Union, some parts of the Soviet Union that were annexed after the war, of course, do have this phenomenon, is that we see a first generation of youth come of age that grew up under state socialism, and this happens around the late 60s. All these youths grow up in societies with a lot of structural commonalities in the political, social, and economical and cultural sphere. I mean, these were authoritarian dictatorships with one-party rule, planned economies that were showing signs of strain and certain problems, and in the cultural sphere there was not much freedom to be expected. And the third element, often overlooked, and I won't be talking too much about that, but there has been quite a lot of research done on that on separate countries, is the phenomenon of the global 60s and the youth culture, the global 60s behind the Iron Curtain. In all countries we see in the 60s a popularity or rising popularity of rock music. We see certain elements of a specific youth fashion arise, and we even see national variations in every country of the hippie movement emerge. Now, in order to see if there are any links in the broader region of the Soviet bloc, there are some core questions one needs to ask, and this is, should we look at the events of '68 through domestic or international frames? Should we actually take student protests as the key events in that year? Are there other comparative dimensions that we should be looking at? And of course, when talking about transnationalism, it's the issue of cross-border exchanges. Did any of those exchanges that were worthwhile mentioning take place that year? And finally, can we discern some common legacies from what took place throughout the socialist camp in 1968? Now, I'll try to talk about this going through 3 general themes, and the first will be the issue of student protest and rebellion. The second, I'll focus on the 9th World Festival of Youth and Students that took place in Bulgaria that year. And then finally, a short, brief discussion on the situation of the official youth and student organizations in the countries. Now, I won't have time to go into any deep details per country, so I'll just try to throw in some examples and try and stick with my more broader reflection upon if we can see a bigger, broader picture of commonalities in the socialist bloc in 1968. As I've already said, 1968 turned out to be this iconic symbol of the year of the student. And if we take the March student revolt in Poland as the benchmark for the socialist bloc, coming as early as it did in the year, with all the domestic entanglements we've been hearing also about in the conference, the anti-Semitic campaign, the crackdown on intellectual and cultural milieus, the factional power struggle in the PZPR, we can actually indeed argue that it was rather the exception than the rule that year. And as I've said, Polish historians and protagonists have often stressed this element, that the Polish student revolt didn't have much to do with what was going on in the West, let alone with the student and youth movements and revolts in the global South that year. And it is certainly true that Polish students faced very specific circumstances in the context of an authoritarian dictatorship, but it is often forgotten that it was this anti-authoritarian drive that Polish students in 1968 had in common with their peers elsewhere, also in the West. This was something that was characteristic for youth in the global 60s more generally. And then, of course, the issue of protests. The Polish protest was not the only one to emerge in the socialist camp. 3 months after the March events in Poland, police violently broke up a student gathering in the Yugoslav capital in Belgrade. As a result, more protests broke out, spreading to other academic centers. The students used the slogan, "The press lies." This should sound quite familiar to anybody who has studied Polish March. The regime blamed the rebellion on foreign agents, and its repression targeted not only students, but professors who were sympathetic, among others those who were involved in the Praxis Group. And the Praxis Group was a Marxist thinking journal where, among others, people like Leszek Kołakowski and Zygmunt Bauman were involved in. In the end, during these few weeks, Yugoslav students also actively invoked the example of their Polish peers in March. So they knew what happened in March. But preceding both revolts, it was actually Czech and Slovak students who had become politicized somewhat earlier, already in late 1967. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of what happened during the Prague Spring and students, but the developments in Czechoslovakia and the ensuing Prague Spring invasion and so on inspired Polish students and vice versa. And this has been confirmed by many protagonists and witness accounts. This was really a case in the Eastern Bloc where we could speak of transnational influence in these protest movements and grassroots students' movements. It was in Prague as well, with its more liberal atmosphere, that students from the Socialist Bloc could come into contact with peers from the West. And here we often see that at the time there were already these differences that immediately came to the fore between, let's say, the ideological outlook of Western student activists and Czech and Slovak students who were involved in the Prague Spring movement. However, later on, there have been also Czech student activists who have said that, well, they did acknowledge the same anti-authoritarian mood and that there was a similar disaffection with the powers that be. Similarly, Czechoslovakia really seems to be this hub from which certain influences in the Eastern Bloc emanate. We've just heard about East Germany, but the East German Freie Deutsche Jugend, on the one hand, managed to curb any excessive spillover effect because there were instances of expressions of sympathy with what was going on with Prague. They also had contacts with Czechoslovak students in the Czechoslovak Youth Organization. But at the same time, while managing to prevent any outbursts of protest, they were also not successful in mobilizing really on a mass scale against the supposed dangers emanating from Prague. Neighboring Hungary to Czechoslovakia had a much more liberal atmosphere and at the time was passing certain reforms to the economy. But even there, the regime's exponents were worrying about Western influence and youth counterculture among the younger generation. In Romania and Yugoslavia, the regimes were sympathetic, at least outwardly, to the Czechoslovak reformers, and they could buy some credit among their country's youth with that. But at the end of the year in '68, when Romanian students staged protests, this seems to have been one of the factors in the general crackdown in the years to follow by the Ceausescu regime. Finally, the importance of the Prague Spring can be perceived in the fact that when the invasion took place, we see multiple instances throughout various socialist countries of spontaneous protest actions. Sure, these were small scale, but they were in any case a sign of exceptional human courage, and they did point to the Prague Spring as this important transnational signifier for the regime. So when we look at mass student protests in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia in '68, we see that there are similar scenarios, similar repertoires of work, and mutual reciprocal references to each other's protests. But where there was no outbreak of protests, we can nevertheless, in these societies, trace similar discontent among the younger generation, which more often than protest, would actually translate into apolitical apathy towards the political process, and more in particular towards the official youth organizations, and I'll say a few things about that later. I've already mentioned the impact and the influence of the youth culture of the global 60s in the bloc, and in Bulgaria, we see a fledgling hippie movement arise, but there is no youth protest worth mentioning in this period. But on the other hand, in mid-1968, something unusual happens when the Bulgarian government prematurely announces a rise in stipends 3 months before the law would actually be enacted. And this was seen by observers at the time that the regime nevertheless conceived discontent in the student milieu and treated it as a potential serious problem. And it should be noted that when it comes to the instances of protest, like in Poland, that this very much occurred to what scholars of student movements see as a kind of classic blueprint of student protest, where it acts as a catalyst for a broader upheaval. So an initial protest by students met by violence, this triggers more protests and can bring in other social groups into the protest. This happened in Poland, where we see that high school pupils and young workers joined the riots on the street. It's a fact that even now, today, protest movements tend to be very dynamic phenomena. They can rapidly change their course over time and their constellation of participants. Different groups can take part in the same mass action, and what sociologists would call there are floating signifiers at work, in the sense that the same protest action can carry different meanings for various participants at the same time. So when we think of Poland, while it were the Komandosi who instigated the protest by organizing the March rally, it doesn't necessarily mean that the thousands of students and high school pupils and workers around the country who joined the protest saw it necessarily through the same lens. But what the March protest did show, that this was an outburst of discontent among the country's younger generation, be it students, high school pupils, or young workers. It were the young who took to the streets. So ultimately, the question whether mass student protest took place or not boiled down to a matter of local conditions and very specific triggers, because we can ask the question, if on the 8th of March there had been no incursion into the university and students would not have beaten up, would we have seen a student protest movement? We don't know. It's simply, that's not what happened. But what we can see is a similar process among the younger generation from country to country of discontent gradually arise. And in one case, this then led to protest. In another case, this rather translated as apathy. From a more overall point of view politically, I would say that one should not underestimate the symbolic significance of the Prague Spring, not only because of the spontaneous protests that broke out after the invasion, but also because of the fact that student activists then later turned into dissidents and formed even transnational communities with other dissidents based on their experience of '68 as well. Now, while Prague was this sort of international hub where we could see some cross-border exchanges, it was by far not the biggest event that year. Actually, the biggest moment of international coming together of youth from Eastern European countries and Western and even Global South youth happened a few weeks before the invasion of Czechoslovakia in Bulgaria and Sofia, and this was the 9th World Festival of Youth and Students. How much time do we have?
You have another 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, so I'll try to be very brief now. For those of you who don't know, the youth festivals were a remnant of the Cold War age, especially in the 40s and 50s. They were regularly organized by Soviet bloc-affiliated organizations. They were part of the then high Cold War ideological struggle between the East and the West, and they were originally organized in socialist state capitals. They then moved twice to capitals of neutral countries, Vienna and Helsinki. And then the plan was that they could move to the global south in the 60s, but in both cases where there was an intent to do so, this didn't materialize because of coups. This was in Algeria and then later in Ghana, and then the decision was taken to bring the festival back safely behind the Iron Curtain to Bulgaria. At the festival, which we could already see a lot of the effects of the protest movement, the student protest of that year. One indicator, because the festival took place late July, beginning of August, is that the Polish delegation was effectively by far the smallest of all socialist states. On the other hand, the Czechoslovak delegation was quite significant, but it was obstructed and boycotted by the other socialist organizations in a bid to try and isolate them. This did not completely fail. At the opening ceremony, where tens of thousands of people attended in the National Stadium, the Czechoslovak delegation, while passing through by the tribune, chanted slogans in favor of Dubček and was met with wide applause. These festivals, they in the past and in '68 was even on a larger scale, they often had adverse effects despite their political and ideological aims. In the first place, because this was a moment when youth from the socialist bloc could encounter youth from the West, and there was a certain spillover effect and a certain shock effect of how different their lives was. And while in Prague we could see oppositional student activists, rebellious student activists mingle with Western European activists. And in Sofia, we would see student activists from the official youth organizations confront Western peers, and this led to pretty tense situations. And at one point, you had West German students who tried to stage an anti-war Vietnam rally, and they were met by Bulgarian militia and worker active who dispersed the rally in a very reminiscent fashion of what happened also in March in Poland. In the end, the festival exposed problems relating to youth organizations and policies in the Soviet bloc, not only in Bulgaria, but in other countries as well. And these youth organizations, their discourse, their mode of operation was perceived as sterile and formalistic, not only by students from the socialist bloc, but Western students, and especially also from students from the global South countries. These organizations clearly were getting out of touch with the youth of their countries. And this is one aspect that is usually also not considered when talking about the March '68 revolt, because it happened a few years later. But one of the consequences of the March revolt was that the regime undertook to change the constellation of the youth organizations. This happened ultimately by '73, when the last cohorts of students who had taken part in the revolt left the university. We see a similar process take place in Czechoslovakia, where they have to change the name and the structure of the youth organization during the normalization period. But in countries where this didn't go that far, you would see the party leadership state serious criticisms towards the youth organizations. In Bulgaria, at the end of '67, Todor Zhivkov himself, in his thesis on youth, attacks the Komsomol leadership for being completely bureaucratized and out of touch with the needs of the country's youth. There's an attempt to reform these organizations, but to no avail. It doesn't pan out, and these organizations gradually become ever more bureaucratized, disconnected from what really relates to youth, and in a way ultimately atrophied, that you see that by '89 these organizations just wither away or collapse immediately. This indicates that the socialist regimes had a general youth problem. Not only student youth, because as we have seen in the protests, these were also protests that were joined by other groups of youth, like young workers. I'd like to point to one more legacy, because I think I'm 2 minutes out of time, is that while we think very often of '68 of also producing these student activists who turn into dissidents and are in touch with each other, we often forget to look at the other side. Many of the top activists of the official youth organizations around this time in '68. They go on to have careers in their party establishments, but you also see that they, just like the organizations fail to fulfill their role to win youth for the cause of socialism, they also abandon this ideology and at the right time show up as either reform-minded communists or agents of change. So in '89 we see some of these leaders negotiating for the regime's side at the round table in Poland. In other places like Romania and Bulgaria, we see them take on even more important positions in the post-communist governments. Now, I'll just try to round up with a few comments here. Okay, so I'm not entirely sure if my title, being transnational, is exactly appropriate when it comes to '68. I believe it is when it comes to '89. We do see some cross-border exchanges among students in '68. They are probably not pivotal or decisive in what goes on. On the other hand, we see very common reactions among the regimes. So there is a certain comparative entangled element going on due to the more or less structural similarities of these societies. Also, the fear of the regimes ultimately that something, some kind of revolt like in the West could take place in their countries drives them to criticize these youth organizations. But in the end, the one common feature we see all over the socialist bloc is that the younger generation is moving away, is apathetical towards the initial ideals of socialism. And within 2 decades later, these problems just exacerbate. And this is one of the reasons that can help explain why in '89 we see students come out on the streets, create very similar movements, anti-communist movements with very similar demands and referring to each other's protests and activism in '89. And this is because I think that we can see '68 as a general precursor to the events in '89. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Our next speaker is Professor Petrescu. He is a professor of contemporary, comparative politics and recent history in the Department of Political Science at the University of Bucharest. He is chairman of the board of the National Council for the Study of the Securitate Archives. And his special field is not only the communist regimes in East Central Europe, but also the post-89 transitions to democracy. And he's the author of many books. I should like to mention only one, Entangled Revolutions, the breakdown of the communist regimes in East Central Europe, which came out in 2014. And Professor Petrescu is now speaking about the specificities of a transnational year 68, belated de-Stalinization and student unrest in Romania.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I would like also to thank the organizers for giving me the chance to speak here in front of a very informed audience. Without many other details I would like to enter, we have just a limited time here, and Romania is traditionally under-researched as compared to Poland, Hungary, former East Germany. So I decided first, before talking about the significance of 1968, because in Romania usually the key event is Ceausescu's finest hour, his discourse on 21st of August 1968, when he condemned an invasion to which he was not invited, that is the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Usually some two other major events are overlooked, and this is April 68, a belated post-Madrid de-Stalinization or Ceausescu-Khrushchevite moment when he condemned the specter of his predecessor, the Stalinist Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, and also the December 1968, 24th of December, Christmas unrest, student unrest in Bucharest. It was an event centered on Bucharest, very much alike what happened in Warsaw, but very different in essence. Now, also because the case of Romania, it's generally under research, I prepared just 3 slides to define the general context from which 1968, Romania in August of 68 was born. And first, it's about the issue of revolution from above, the fact that it was very little revolutionary experience of Romanian communists. To quote Robert Sitaka, their revolutions was just the second revolution, the revolution from above. It was a very small party, Communist Party in Romania in the interwar period, just 900 to 1,000 members. At the end of the Second World War, they were put in power by the Soviet tanks, so their revolution was just the revolution from above, particularly harsh. The second slide is going to tell you this, but what is important, they had a profound legitimacy deficit, exactly because there was such a small and marginal communist party, and also, of course, very much like in other countries, but perhaps more than in other countries of East Central Europe, communism in Romania was imposed from abroad and above. And then it's also very important the fact that the Stalinist repression in Romania was carried out in 2 waves. First it was 1945, 1956, and the second wave of repression was in the aftermath of the Hungarian Revolution of October-November 56. It started in 1958 and came to an end in 1964. Now, what is important here is, I would like to emphasize, and now we have proof of this, is about the files of the former secret police in Romania, the infamous Securitate, about the level of political violence and repression in Romania. Now the figures are converging to 150,000 people dead and 2 million victims, that is, people deported to USSR, especially the members of German community, for house arrest, deportation within the country, and many other issues. Of course, one of the major events, and perhaps this is why Romania is so famous, is the so-called Pitești experiment, is the experiment in the prison, Stalinist prison in the city of Pitești, some 100 kilometers north of Bucharest, when inmates were torturing other inmates. It's somehow similar, but not matched by the Goliotok phenomenon in former Yugoslavia. Now, of course, you have here on the screen some of the things that came out, especially after 1989, but more so after 2005, when the files of the former Securitate became widely available. It's a long story about opening the files of the secret police. We don't have to touch upon this here, but basically after 2005, many files actually permitted us to document the level of repression and the revolution, the political violence in Romania. Now, what is interesting in the case of Romania is that we have to do with anti-Soviet Stalinists. Actually, national communism in Romania was not born from looking from a Romanian path to socialism, as Gomulka sought it at the end of the Second World War, and this was marginalized but not killed, is the fact that Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej and his Stalinists, who were put in power by the Soviet tanks, in the aftermath of the secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, tried to cautiously distance themselves from Moscow by returning to national values, but also trying to fight the Romanian path to socialism. This was a very slight nationalism, not so much as Ceausescu would do, but what is really important is that the Hungarian Revolution of 23rd of October, 4th of November 1956 gave the Romanian Stalinists a chance to show their subservience to Moscow and finally convince Khrushchev to withdraw the Soviet troops from Romania, a process that was completed in the summer of '58. Now, in April 1964, finally, Romanian communists issued, which is generally known in Romanian history as the Declaration of April '64, the idea that each and every communist party actually should have been left to find its own path to socialism. Now, what is really important is that de-Stalinization, and I'm coming to the first significant moment of '68 in Romania, which is generally overlooked because of what happened basically in the 1980s with the flamboyant nationalism of Ceausescu, structural crisis, forced assimilation of Hungarian minority, and so on and so forth. Basically, it is overlooked the fact that in April 1968, a process that was started, and now we have proof in the secret police archives, just after coming to power, Ceausescu ordered in '65 a commission to look into the crimes committed by Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, of course, on the Khrushchevite model against party members, not against innocent victims in society. And that particular commission, of course, found out what was already known within the party, that leaders like Ștefan Foriș and especially Lucrețiu Pătrășcanu, who was jailed in 1948 and was assassinated in prison in 1954, after the death, 1 year after the death of Stalin, at the direct orders of Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, were actually innocent victims of the Stalinist leader Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej. This was a very interesting moment because the Romanian de-Stalinization period was belated and very short. Actually, it lasted from 1968 to 1971 in July, when Ceausescu issued the so-called thesis of July '71, a renationalization, autochthonization of culture. Now, what is the most important thing is that at that particular moment in April '68, Ceausescu emerged from the collective leadership during the period '65-'68 as the undisputed leader of the party, but it's something really important, the renationalization of the infamous secret police, the Securitate. Up to that moment, Ceausescu was part of the apparatus, but in April '68, he could claim that actually up to that moment, the Securitate was KGB supported and could blame the Soviet counselors. In '68, in April, it was the moment of renationalization of the Securitate. The Securitate and the regime could become national again. And this is extremely important, we shall see. Now, here, rather dull pictures, but they are on the website of the National Council for the Study of Securitate archives in Bucharest. Now, are the digital versions. Now, this Ancheta, the inquiry of the documents, the originals are on the website. If you have an internet connection and you know to read Romanian, you can have access to the inquiry I was talking about starting in '65. They are all on the website. You can just access them. This is the picture, rather dull icon on the right. On the left, also on the same website of the National Council for the Study of the Securitate archives, you have the official documents. It's a series of 31 documents, but this is about 1968, all the official speeches of Nicolae Ceausescu. Then you can compare official position of the party and up to few years ago, 4 years ago, documents about the inquiry of the party in '68. That stayed at the basis of this plenary session of April '68. Now is the final moment of Ceausescu, and unfortunately, this would actually affect Romanian history in the 1970s and the 1980s. He is the first dissident of the country. In 21st of August, 1 day before, he was just inaugurating the Pitești automobile enterprise. French President Charles de Gaulle visited Romania in May '68, and on 20th of August, Ceausescu inaugurated Pitești enterprise, the automobile that first started the production of Renault 8, Dacia 1100, and then the icon of Romanian communism, the Renault 12 Romanian version, Dacia 1300. Now it was revived, perhaps you know the revived Dacia, and the slogan, another one, drives the duster. Now, at this moment, on 21st of August, Ceausescu, this is the canonical photographed Ceausescu talking to the crowds. And this is important because what I would say, this brought something that the Romanian party sought from the very beginning of this formation, legitimation. But legitimation in the case of Romania is based on three fundamental issues. It was not by chance that I was talking about the Dacia 1300, because legitimation of the Romanian Communist Party came in that particular moment in August 68 based on three key elements: industrialization, identity politics, and independence from Moscow. These are really important because, for instance, after the moment 21st of August 68, Romanian communists started to put a special emphasis on history, legitimation through history, but not recent history, not the deeds of the Romanian communists during the Second World War, because there were not much to talk about, but the distant past, the medieval past, based on the four historical myths of the Romanian nation, which are ancient roots, continuity on the present territory of the country, unity, and struggle for independence. It was not by chance that the myth of Michael the Brave, the condottiere who united the three Romanian principalities of Transylvania, Wallachia, and Moldavia for a brief period, a few months in 1600s, was revived, and the mega production by a Romanian, a darling of the Romanian Communist Party, Sergiu Nicolaescu, a mega production on Michael the Brave was produced immediately after that moment. Now, the road to legitimacy, this is really important, I have already talked about, I would say that this is important if we look to past dependence, agency, and contingency. The moment 68, it's important in the case of Romania because this is, I would say, limited social or empirical legitimacy through consent, following the political philosopher, British political philosopher David Beetham. The idea that it's a sort of legitimacy which allows for delegitimation. So it's based on nation building, socialist modernization, a very modest improvement of living standard after 1965, and relative independence from Moscow. Things would have changed fundamentally for Ceausescu and not in his advantage after Gorbachev came to power in 1985, and Romanians started to look with hope to Moscow to get rid of Ceausescu, and one of the great pillars of Ceausescu's legitimacy, independence from Moscow, did not function anymore. And now you have two images at the same place, the same palace square. Now, to the left, you have 1968, people cheering Ceausescu for his bold stance. Now here, to the right, it's 22nd of December 1989. In the middle, there it's written, "Down with the tyrant." So it's exactly what I was talking about, delegitimation of Ceausescu. Now, after this, well, I still have some minutes to talk about Christmas 1968. It was not very much similar with what happened in March 68 in Warsaw. It was also a byproduct of Ceausescu's finest hour of 68. It was a very interesting state of mind among Romanian students and Romanian population at large. It was one of the more, I spoke with many of those who were in the Palace Square in 68 on 21st of August. They were proud of being Romanians and they were proud of communist Romania. It was perhaps the only moment when many Romanians, so many Romanians, were proud to be citizens of communist Romania. But in that particular, 68 is a key year also in terms of youth culture in Bucharest and the rest of the country. The first jazz clubs were born, rock culture. Many things happened in 67, 68, also because in 67 something happened. It's about the international tourism year. Tourism was a passport for peace. It was the slogan at the time, and it was a relaxation of the border control in Romania. Many Romanians started, for the first time ever, were allowed to travel to the so-called fraternal countries, but also to the West. Also, it was a secondary, as a consequence of this, many Romanians started to leave their country for good. fleeing the country through Turkey and Austria. The two countries, they're easier to be reached from Romania, and then they flew to the west. Now, what happened actually in 1968 on Christmas was a sort of manifestation that was linked with the fascination of Christmas. Was not celebrated officially at the time. We are not celebrating Christmas but New Year. It was not it was John Frost and not Christmas. We were not celebrating, but at that particular moment, some students from two majors, so it's a technical university and law school in Bucharest, they were singing carols. They went to the dormitory where was inhabited particularly by girls, were female there, and then of course they sang carols. It was a rather peaceful demonstration. It was not at the moment, was not about protests, but they started at some point, they started to march through downtown Bucharest. They were singing carols, but also in two major squares, the Cogălnicianu and University Square, they started to dance the Hora Unirii, which is the Union Round Dance, celebrating 1st of December 1918, unification of Transylvania with the Old Kingdom. And what is interesting is that at some point they were passing through the Czechoslovak embassy. They started to cheer the Czechoslovaks, and it was also clearly linked with the moment of Ceausescu's condemnation of invasion of Czechoslovakia. City dwellers were sympathetic to students. Now it's interesting that Securitate followed closely the march. They did not intervene. Some political, from the Union of Communist Youth, Securitate, of course, infiltrated the crowd, but they did not intervene in force. They started to talk with students, started to tell them that it would be wise to disperse. They didn't want to do that. Nevertheless, at some point, some ringleaders were identified. One of them, Anna Shinkai, she provided a witness account, one of the most important regarding the event. She was the next day she was arrested and given a 6-month term in prison. Other 3 or 4 leaders, ringleaders identified by the Securitate were also arrested, but she got the longest term in prison. What is interesting is on 26th of December 68, it was a meeting of the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Youth. At the time, the secretary, who was Ion Iliescu, the first post-communist president of the country, was extremely harsh on the students, and he was also asking for administrative punishment. But still, in university culture in Romania, that particular demonstration is known for the fact that it was introduced the winter break for students. Up to that moment, Romanian students did not have a Christmas, New Year Eve break. Now vacation of 2 weeks was introduced because of that demonstration. Now, the roots, still some research is going on in Romania looking into the secret police files, talking with the participants to those events. Is definitely not a general protest. There were some slogans at the time when during the demonstration for liberty, more liberty for students, but not protest, because as I said, Ceausescu was already the first dissident. He was in the popular psyche, folk culture. He was actually defending the country against Soviets. Of course, afterwards, not longer afterwards, Romanians would discover that it was not like so. Like a peasant from his village of Scornices, he just wanted to be left alone to do whatever he wanted on his plot of land. Fortunately, it was the whole country, Romania. But in '68, many believed that it was the beginning of liberalization. Unfortunately, it was the closure of it. Now, I'm coming to my final statement. This is just a wrap-up about the threefold significance of the 1968 moment, key moment in Romania: belated desalinization, legitimation through consent, and student unrest, but not in terms of protesting fiercely against the regime. And finally, instead of the formal traditional "thank you for your attention" slide, I put a dissident caricature by Romanian anti-communist dissident artist Mihai Stănescu. Is from the 1980s, because now in Europe, looking to illiberal politics, rise of populism and resurgence of nationalism, perhaps we should think about lessons that seems not to have been learned properly. So I would leave you with this, but nevertheless, I do thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Bratescu. And our last and final speaker is Andrzej Czyżewski, and he will speak about March 68 generation or generations, the case of Lodz.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this invitation and introduction. I will try to explain my general concern about the concept of generation when we are talking about experience of March 68 from other perspective than Warsaw perspective. And as this presentation is based on approximately 25 narrative interviews conducted with people who took part. Who took part in March events in Łódź. I'm especially interested in the problem whether we can talk about potential local variants of March 68 generation or not. The reason for undertaking this research is based on a preliminary analysis of biographical material that suggests it is not possible to fully translate an existing pattern of interpreting the March 68 generation onto Łódź and the distinct differences going on there at the time. This is because the existing pattern is based on, in most cases, on biographical material provided by Warsaw residents. In other words, we see the March 68 generation mostly through their eyes, meaning the people who were in the center of the March events. So my question is there a possibility that we can say something new about March 68 generation using more of non-Warsaw approach? The initial research hypothesis predicts that there is a certain scientifically established canon of interpreting biographical interviews with people involved in events of March 68 in Poland. This canon is, in most cases, is built on, as I said, on interviews with participants of March 68 from Warsaw and represents three main perspectives of interpreting those events. The first approach puts emphasis on the issue of anti-Semitic experience and social exclusion. The second one is perspective of participant of anti-systemic protests. In the third perspective, the key element is the political crisis among the Communist Party leaders. Those types of interpretations set the tone for the social and cultural phenomena commonly referred to us as the March 68 generation. As I said, this canon, and this is why I'm interested in this situation, is based on this Warsaw view. In the area of, in the area of academic reflection, most of the existing analysis of March 68 generations used the category of generation proposed by Karl Mannheim as a part of his sociology of knowledge, which mostly emphasized the community of experiences and the language used to describe them. Thus understood, generation, despite the passage of time and changes in the social and political situation, most frequently falls within patterns drawn from the political history, which, as it's commonly known, mainly actuates the role of individuals or group in the historical process. My main goal is to verify to what extent the three main times of narratives of March 68 can be identified in the stories of participants of those events in Łódź, and to look for possible ways of making an in-depth interpretation of this division. The idea behind the research, however, is not to question the existing interpretative canon, but to attempt to take into consideration some suggestions from, for example, biographical method, which I will explain later, what I'm talking here about. Here it is impossible to escape the question about the extent to which the initially distinguished main types of biographical experience of March 68 draw from narrative patterns present within professional historiography and journalism, and to what extent they co-create them. The question is not new, and it's not typical only to of the Polish realities. In international academic research, a serious and wide-ranging discussion has been taking place for a few decades about the relationship between private narratives, mostly created for one's own family, and the official narratives, meaning those that dominate the public sphere, thus co-creating the collective memory of a given community. One of the most significant elements of this discussion is twofold character of the category of generation, which might be a narrative tool for those building the autobiographical stories, or an analytical tool for those who undertake to interpret these stories. It is worth noting that significant elements of this discussion are reflected in the international debate on the phenomena of year 68. We should also remember that in the Polish People's Republic, apart from the fully ideologized interpretation of March 68 provided by authorities, there soon appeared a certain March founding narrative, which was mostly provided by anti-systemic opposition. This dissident story of March 68 mainly drew on autobiographical narratives created beyond the reach of censorship. The March events were not isolated cases. The output of oral history in the Polish People's Republic was connected with political history focused on traumatic events. This phenomena was described by, for example, Dobrotna Kauwa. From this perspective, involvement in March protests became some sort of formative event for a part of Polish post-war intelligentsia, falling within the ethos of the fight for freedom and truth, which was a kind of prelude to solidarity movement, and then Poland regaining independence as a result of the so-called roundtable talks and the June elections of 1989. During this period of social and political transformation in 1989, the previously marginalized and discredited story of March 68 and the generation originating from it became the basis for the official message concerning those events. It should also be noted that there is a certain tradition of research in Poland conducted within the broadly defined oral history perspective and referring directly to the events of '68 and the phenomena of Polish 68ers. And some books, authors were mentioned, like Hanna Świta-Ziemna, but also yesterday Joanna Wiśniewicz. We should also, I think, in this context, remember the book by Teresa Torańska, and of course the latest one by Piotr Osenka. Also, because Tom Jones is also in this panel, he also refers to this phenomena of March 68 in his latest book. Those authors enrich our perception of March 68 by the experience of specific groups or cycles, and of course, those publications are obvious point of reference for my presentation. Now I will try to explain this research methodology, because this is a crucial thing. I think this is something what I'm trying to develop right now. I'm trying to use some tools of so-called biographical method in the spirits of Fritz Schitzer research proposal, especially the concept of biographical process structures, structural processes which are used to analyze narrative biographical interviews. And this is a quote from one of Fritz Schitzer's works. In the special way of enactment and interpretation, these biographical structural processes are the most unique and personal ordering devices for individual biographies. On the other hand, the basic constitutive mechanism universally occur in biographies of all kinds. The backbones of structural processes of biography are specific activity relationship of the biography incumbent to the pertinent phases of his or her life. And those four relationships which I'm using to analyze interviews which I conducted are trajectory, meaning being overwhelmed by superior events, biographical action plan, meaning actively shaping the course of life, institutional patterns of the life course, following up institutionally shaped and normatively defined courses of life. And the fourth one is biographical metamorphosis of biographical identity, new important inner development in one's own biography. So I try to use those tools while analyzing those materials that I'm familiar with, meaning the interviews with participants of March 68 in Łódź. And what were results? What were the results? In most of the interviews conducted so far with the participants of March 68 in Łódź, the constant and recurring motive turned out to be the trajectory thread of struggle with anonymous processes limiting the possibility of acting. In this case, a sense of lack of any influence on the course of one's own biography was amplified by such events as arrests, anonymous threat letters, insult at the university, dismissals, and pressure to leave Poland. And there's a quote from one of the interviews. There were moments at the end of the last period of studies when a door to a room I had never been in before suddenly opened. I mean that I was different. I had never been a person treated differently, but when this crisis arose, the fact that I'm of Jewish origin became very significant. The motive mentioned is clearly visible in the quoted analysis of the narratives of the March 68 generation conducted in Warsaw. Thus, trajectory defined in such a way becomes a motive linking the experience of the central, meaning Warsaw, and the peripheral, meaning Łódź generation. Similarly, a uniting category turns out to be a collective variant of the biographical action plan, which in the realities of 1968 referred to a positive interpretation of one's own involvement in the massive protest movement present in both Warsaw and in Łódź. Another quote, the very outbreak of March was a reflex of solidarity slightly stimulated. Anyway, our first response in Łódź was probably the demonstration in front of the university library. Then there were different events at the faculty, including a night-long strike. So this is also the thing that, the link between those two perspectives. But on the contrary, institutional pattern of the life course seems to be a useful tool allowing researchers to capture and then explain significant differences between the perspective of the central and peripheral generations through reference to the social roles performed by the representatives. The point is that many of accounts provided by participants of events of 68 in Łódź do not fit within a typical pattern of the central perspective, particularly when it's narrowed down to the commando circles. In this pattern, March 68 is interpreted as a formative event that created a certain environment for people. The years that follow saw people getting deeply involved in opposition activity, and after the transformation of 1989 became symbolic elites of the Third Polish Republic. In other words, from the peripheral provincial perspective, the experience of March 68 is not necessarily a story with a happy ending. Quite the contrary. It is associated with a sense of unfulfillment and marginalization. In several cases, as can be expected, the leitmotif of interviews collected was intentional counter-narration against the canon of stories about the biographical involvement in the events of 68 and its long-term consequences. The peripheral, the provincial perspective will become a useful tool that will shed new light on disputes between representatives of different variants of Polish 68 generation. This is what I think. That does not mean, however, that the interviewees from Łódź only displayed the tendencies to interpret the experience at the time, mostly traumatic, in a negative context. Interestingly, in the peripheral variant of positive biographical metamorphosis of biographical identity, this is the term from Schütze-Works, concerns the professional sphere. For example, some of the interviewees strongly connected with the academic world emphasize independently of one another that changing the research interests or academic center as a result of the active involvement in student protest turned out to be quite positive, opening new career paths and broadening the horizons. Another quote to support my statement. Generally, this was all very good for me because, first of all, I was introduced into the Warsaw Society where, of course, I met Kuroń, who will always remember me. I used to visit him at home. So this was one of the benefits. Had it not been for the whole affair, I wouldn't have been employed in the Polish Academy of Science. I would have been stuck here meaning Łódź. These circumstances are also, to a certain extent, dissimilar to the Warsaw canon of March stigmatization, within which a significant role is played by, for example, the element of exclusion and closing the planned career paths, which at the level of institutional life course supports the role of a professional dissident. So they were not allowed to continue their academic interest within some years they became a professional dissident. I will try to somehow sum up what I've said. In the context of translating the Mannheimian category of generation into the realities of March 68, its concept of generation units, differing in terms of their world view, might prove useful. According to Mannheim, the generation unit represents a much more concrete bond than the actual generation as such. Youth experiencing the same concrete historical problems may be said to be a part of the same actual generation, while those groups within the same actual generation which woke up the material of the common experiences in a different specific ways constitute separate generation units. So according to Mannheim, within a generation which is still perceived in terms of mediated experience, because this is still experience, we might face the crystallization of completely different point of views which bond different generation units. Dealing with this idea comprehensively, I think, would offer an opportunity to present in a broader and more balanced way different types of March experience, meaning the central and the peripheral, which on certain levels tend to be strongly antagonized. In other words, it seems highly probable that when we talk about different variants of generations originating from the events of 68, what we really mean are only different generational units, which together make up one generation of March 68. So it is, from my point of view, it is very possible that even the fully realized community of faith and experience does not necessarily offer a uniform interpretation. And this is only an outline and first hypothesis after analyzing the material that I've collected. But from my point of view, it seems that we can talk about a generation unit from Łódź and generation unit from Warsaw. And this is all I've got for today. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, can we rejoin here? Thank you for this picture from Łódź, and we have now 20 or so minutes for your questions, for your comments, for your remarks. This gentleman here, over here, is the first one.
Yeah, so I have a question primarily to Tom Jones, but maybe some of the other participants could answering it also. In the West, the 68 movement was also considered as the beginning of a kind of sexual revolution. And yeah, for the women liberation, gay liberation, for instance, all these movements were in a way now connected to the 68 events in the West as a beginning, in a way, as a symbolic beginning. How was it in the East? Was it, you just mentioned the hippies, which maybe can be a hint to that there are something similar, but yeah, was this in a way explicit in in certain aspects, or was it completely out of the discourse of the youth in the Eastern countries?
Who wants to take up this question? You were addressed, yeah? Mm-hmm. You have to.
Thank you for that question. It's one that often comes up, of course, and I mean, I would first of all say that this is, of course, an association also exposed very much that you hear in the East that, oh, we have this cultural revolution, this sexual revolution happening in the West. This was certainly not the full experience of 68, and depending on the countries where that took place, but it was, of course, more pronounced than in Eastern Europe. I think the experiences here are different. I mean, because to quote one Czechoslovak activist afterwards, he said the main difference, well, when I mentioned this anti-authoritarian mood, is that you could describe it that in the West they were fighting for freedom from something, as in the East they were fighting for freedom for something, or for certain freedoms. But you did have this element in the East nonetheless among youth. But even there it could differ on national context. So just to be brief, like with one example, if you, for instance, examine the security apparatus documents relating to Polish hippies, you see very explicit descriptions of a certain, well, let's say sexual behavior that would qualify to something similar in the West. Among hippies in Romania, this is, for instance, not so explicit. Let's not forget, in a society where abortion is outlawed, engaging in free sexual behavior is perhaps not the best of socially ambitious, activities. So this was very low on the agenda. So yeah, I mean, it is a difference, but I wouldn't put it to that extreme as black or white, as if the West was all flower power, make love, not war, and you didn't have it in the East.
Thank you. The next is the gentleman over there. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to hear from any or all members of the panel about the influence of the media, particularly television, in '68. In other words, in what ways did it inspire students to see things going on in other countries as much as the regime might try to suppress knowledge? What role did television or radio play in these events? And regarding the last talk about Łódź, which I found very suggestive, I just wonder, though, have your 25 interviews really upset the canon that you spoke of at the beginning? For example, just to take one obvious question, did a smaller percentage of the people from Łódź actually leave Poland than those from Warsaw? To take a simple example, in what ways was the canon really upended? Because it seems to be that it's basically the same themes, except for the theme about the central government, which was left out of your outline about Łódź. Thank you.
Would you want to start?
Yeah, and I can also.
Well, I would say, at least for the case of Romania, but there were no information on TV or radio. The source of information was obviously Radio Free Europe. So Radio Free Europe, for some days in August '68, was even allowed to play loudly, some programs of Radio Free Europe. It happened just once afterwards. In the case of Romania, it was in the very dire situation of the great earthquake of March, 4th of March, '77, when again people could listen rather freely to Radio Free Europe for 1 week. But otherwise, there was no information about what happened in other countries. People would, at least younger generations, would inform themselves from the late programs of Radio Free Europe, and this created, now we have proof in the Securitate files, especially because, the political program was just before the late night dedication, musical dedication, so people would listen to musical dedications and then but again, they went through a process of political socialization, listening to these programs. But what happened in Romania, and this I'm finishing with it, it's a very smart move by the party and by court, as we used to call them poets, like Adrian Păunescu, confiscating the alternative culture. For instance, in Romania, there was no dissident rock or underground movement. It was a sort of cenacle of youth culture, basically confiscating the youth culture under the aegis of a so-called movement. It was a cenacle that they were organizing all kind of shows on stadiums, pretending to be a sort of alternative culture, but basically they were confiscating alternative culture and actually channeling it towards nationalism and cult of personality of Ceausescu, which already started again in August '68.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Well, then we have at least to distinguishing the communication channels. As Dragos Petrescu mentioned, Radio Liberty or Radio Free Europe has a significant role in and played had a quite large impact, I guess, in each of these Soviet bloc countries, with one exclusion, East Germany. East Germany was part of a German communication system, so all East Germans could listen to West German TVs and radio stations. But I would also then shed some light how intensively what broadcasted, for example, the events of March '68 on the West German broadcasting stations, radio or TV, compared then to the Prague Spring. It seems to me the difference is quite significant for obvious reasons. It was a process with the Prague Spring which lasted over months, even years, and it was came from above and was connected with numerous hopes, as well as the economic reforms, but cultural. There was the famous Kafka conference and things like that, which obviously attracted many people in the West, but then it spilled over also partly to East European countries.
Maybe for a second I can also modify my role here and also say something about the influence of the media. I think we have to take into consideration for East Germany, first of all, what has been mentioned already, that except of those who are living in the so-called valley of those who have no clue, Tal der Ahnungslosen around Dresden, the rest of the GDR had the possibility to know and to see every evening what's going on, not only in Germany, but in the Western world. So the Vietnam War protest, for instance, something which is a driving force for the student movements in the West, was to a certain extent obviously very present in the GDR. And I wonder, and I would like to ask the experts for the Eastern Bloc, what kind of role this information, this event played in these countries, because the interesting thing is Western youth organization or student organizations would tend to even organize their demonstrations in a way that it could be broadcasted all over the globe, meaning they would, for instance, there would be a demonstration in Frankfurt, but they would come up with transparents in English. They would come up with the peace sign in order to communicate to their fellow protesters in, let's say, London or in Paris or in Washington. So there was this kind of knowledge of each other and this kind of communicating via the mass media, indirectly, if you want. Are you going to comment on this?
Okay, a short explanation. I agree with that. This is one of the differences we see in protests with dissemination of media and the use of, international languages. Yet, two comments, because, or maybe three even on the Vietnam issue. First of all, I agree with the Radio Free Europe thing here, and I do not know much about television, but rather just reflecting on radio and print media as it reflected within the youth atmosphere. If I look at, for instance, Bulgaria, and I follow the coverage of what goes on in '68 in Poland and in Czechoslovakia, you see that there is practically no information about what is going on in Poland, and there is some information on Czechoslovakia, but not about the grassroots. This is just about the political process, so sort of the top, because of course the Prague Spring was not only this burning down. So one of the reasons we know that, Czechoslovakia with more liberal media hears about what's going on in Poland, is the access to information. And this more or less links to that. So that goes to explain. On the other hand, when it comes to Western protests, and it links a bit to the Vietnam protests, if one looks, for instance, throughout already the late 60s, one takes the official student weekly in Poland. One turns to the first page, it's full of photos of student protests in the West with certain commentary. Because at a certain point, the communist regimes were seeing this as, well, you see, this youth is rising up against these capitalist societies. They had a similar reaction to the hippie movement until they learned more about it and realized that, well, this is not exactly conform with their own ideological outlook. So it was part of the regime propaganda. I think this also plays to a certain extent why, let's say, students in Eastern Europe would not necessarily identify with what was going on in the West because of the channel of information. We can also assume Radio Free Europe didn't really much inform about that either, so they didn't have any. And the same happened with Vietnam. We should not forget that when the Sofia Youth Festival took place, Vietnam became the central theme of that festival. It did not resonate at all. So it was actually the West Germans who came, and they got beaten up by Bulgarian worker militia for trying to stage an anti-Vietnam war rally, whereas the Vietnamese themselves, they were pretty calm because they actually came to the festival and returned with quite a lot of material assistance. So they were quite happy of getting the trip paid and this assistance. So the fact that a lot of the coverage or information about Vietnam or what was going on in the West was actually coming from the regime propaganda, I think is one of the explanations why you see a certain reservation towards these themes among Eastern European youth.
Yeah, very good point. The question
on which... answering those two questions and saying something more, maybe I will emphasize one thing, that in the realities of March '68 in Poland, the official media and the propaganda will somehow triggered the demonstration, the student demonstration, because students were protesting against the official statement. So in that way, television broadcasting, Gomulka, daily news and radio broadcast, they all together somehow mobilized the students. Your question was, what was the percentage? Yes? So, yeah, I know what you mean. So, round about 10% of people who left Poland in '68, '69 was from Łódź. Maybe I should explain that, well, talking about this canon, because this was your major concern, I think that this is the problem of talking about interpretation of biographical involvement in such events. And I was surprised that so many of my interviewees shared totally different experience of, and maybe not only experience, but the totally different interpretation of March 68 and its influence of their lives. So this presentation is somehow trying to deal with this problem. I don't know if this is the best way to deal with it. I'm trying to figure the best way to solve this problem, because this is a real problem. I'm trying to reach, I've reached some of the leaders of 68 in Łódź, I would say simple participants and those who left. And this is what I came up with.
We have two more questions, and I think we answer to the two questions or the two contributions collectively at the end. Joachim von Puttkammer is next.
Thank you for these papers. My question also addresses the broader East-West European dimension. I think it is quite clear and not very controversial that 1968 in the socialist countries was in many respects very much different. You've just had the question on the sexual liberation. If one looks at how how hierarchies in the universities were challenged or less challenged, you would have a broad difference. Tom Jones spoke about an entire generation moving away from socialism in the East. That's not how you would describe what happened in the West. But then, if you look at it that way, you could expect that the experience of 1968 would mark a dividing line, a long-lasting dividing line between experiences in East and West. But if you look at it from today, you would say those intellectual elites who see themselves as being the heroes of 1968, you get the same leftist liberals all over Europe. And the challenges they face from their former fellows who are now sort of competing for this legacy from a more rightist national thing, you would have a similar constellation. And I wonder how could one explain this sort of coming together of two very different and maybe even opposite traditions of 1968 in our present days. Thank you.
Thank you. And here's the last question. This gentleman over here. Do we have more? I'm sorry. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm addressing Dr. Czyżewski's presentation for a very simple and, I would say, personal reason. He was talking about Łódź. Łódź is my native city, and in '68, I was a student of Faculty of Law at this place. So for me, it was very interesting to listen to this depiction of events which took place there. I have a minor suggestion to the problem of approach it could be used while analyzing these issues. As far as I understood, you focused on biographies of people who were directly involved in activities at the time. It seems to me that these biographies are not so very original, that more or less it has been repeated in the very similar pattern in many other places. So if you are looking for specific features of these events in Łódź, I'd suggest that you could see the problem of specific course of this occurrings there. Łódź was the only place among all cities where this was revolts by students, where the militia did not interfere. You have mentioned in your presentation this large rally in front of university library. There were plenty of milicemen around us, and nothing approached us. It took place just in the day when Mr. Gomulka provided his famous speech, 19th of March, and we calmly dispersed, being able to continue our activities. Afterwards, another event, this overnight strike in the Faculty of Law. Again, we were under terrible pressure of militia's aggression. And again, nothing happened. So if you could explain this neutrality, this laziness of militia, maybe it could provide some additional light on this specific course of action.
Thank you for this, and we also take this gentleman over there. I wanted to give you, yeah.
Thank you, Kowalewski. Edycja polska, Polish edition of Diplomatic. It is a fact what you said about what happened during this meeting, and during this meeting, in which what I observed was also the behavior of the so-called active robotniczy, because these people were there, no? And it was not very clear for me if there was an attempt of attack by the militia, but in any case, this workers active, no? Had a clear order to not allow an attack by the militia against the students. It was very, very strange thing, because the behavior of this workers active was collective, no? So there was some type of command. It is the first thing. The second thing I would like to say, I think that Tom Jones said something very important that is absent in this narrative on 68. This is the case of Yugoslavia, of Yugoslavian movement, Yugoslav movement, students' movement. And the fact that this movement explicitly supported the students' movement in Poland, and that philosophers of praxis protested publicly against the repression in the Warsaw University against the professors. I think that it is an important component of this story, and it was told recently in a book published here, a book called Filozofia i Ruchy Społeczne, Philosophy and Social Movements, where a collective work, and there is a chapter on this Yugoslav movement and its link with the Polish students' movement.
Thank you for thank you for this. And we now have a last round here on the table, and all of us are very brief. Otherwise, we don't have the break anymore.
Okay. So maybe I will start with the last two questions, because they both shared the same opinion. So thank you for all your suggestions, and it is now clear for me that maybe I wasn't precise, because the main thesis of my paper was that there are big differences between the perspective from Łódź and Warsaw, and sadly, it seems that I didn't prove that well. But this is what I'm trying to say, that there is a big difference between those two cities in interpreting what March was and how much influenced my own life. I'm focusing on biographical approach. I'm trying to interview people from March, and of course taking under consideration this approach sadly will eliminate other contexts. This is obvious for me, but thank you for all the suggestions and talking to and answering the first question. Personally, I think that that perspective of West and East in '68 is different. And for me, as a historian interested in how the big narratives are created, the phenomena of coming to terms between those two approaches is phenomena also. And I think that this is very important, but I have no clear solution or answer why this is happening from, well, 10 or 15 years, I guess, in the public sphere in Poland, but this is very interesting, and thank you.
If I understand correctly, the question is about why the experience of East and West is different, but yet we see a sort of similar legacy on both sides, despite it being also challenged on both sides. I think, just as an example, 10 years ago, at the 40th anniversary, I was here, and there was a debate with Dani Cohn-Bendit, Adam Michnik, and Petr Uhl. It started off with all three of them hugging. If you read enough interviews, those 68ers from both sides, they do tend to express some generational solidarity, although you would hear from the people in the East, yes, but there were differences and all that. We don't see any debates between those who challenge 68 in the West, or the legacy of 68, and challenge it here, or challenge the dominant narrative, so cannot comment on that, but I think something might also indicate that the difference is that '89 happened in Eastern Europe, and especially '89 and the role some of the 68ers played in this, that this kind of reinforced the role of the 68ers in the East to identify more. I mean, we see this is exactly when a lot of these interviews, when they start coming together and they seemingly see this kind of common values emerge with hindsight from '68.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's quite brief. I would also like to refer then to the question from Professor Puttkammer. Yes, indeed. Well, we have some phenomena which are shared between East and West. I would say it's the kind of creating subcultures and a rather individualistic and anti-authoritarian self-understanding which spilled over from the West to the East, which was adopted some way in the East. But also we have, of course, we have numerous of differences. One is these processes like educational reforms and different living style, which already set in the West in the mid-60s or even earlier. It came out then in '68. These pre-processes we don't have in Eastern Europe. And one thing I have to mention, it's the case of humanizing socialism. I mean, in Prague, met young students from the West and from the East, but certainly they had a different perception. What does it mean, socialism or humanizing socialism? For all participants from the East, they had the real experience. For the Westerners, was it rather a neat utopia?
So I would say that there is about a certain rebelliousness of young generations, and I was the age cohort between 17 years to 24, because in Romania we have a pattern. the 68ers, the 89ers, and then we have January 2017. I mean, huge protests by youngsters against attempt at changing the laws of justice in Romania. It was an attempt, it failed, but of course they are. And I would say that this certain rebelliousness, there is still no very coherent explanation for the very case of Romania, where there was not very strong anti-communist dissent in the post-68 period. And then, but still, if we look to the age cohorts who are active in the 89 regime change, the only bloody regime change in East Central Europe, were exactly those between 17 and 24 years of age, very much those who were actually born of a rebelliousness, born from a misreading, if you want, of what Ceausescu wanted in '68, but again, anti-Soviet and anti-authoritarian, and then what happened in 2017. So basically, this would link the East and West protests.
Yeah, thank you all for this. I mean, I would like to add to Joachim von Puttkammer's description of these leftist liberals all over Europe who are trying to defend the heritage of '68. Well, yes, this is the main picture, but there are also these people from '68 who, in the meantime, turned to the right, especially in the German and West German '68 movement. There are a lot of, well, a lot is probably too much, but there is a significant number of rather prominent earlier '68ers who are now on the right side of the political spectrum. So much for that. Thank you for your patience, and we have only a couple of minutes now left before the student debate, how should March '68 be remembered, will take place right here. Thank you so much.